As one of the faculty members at Stark King School for the Ministry, I often preach about religious education when I'm out on the road. But today's topic is different, one that has, as you heard, touched my life. Like most people, I didn't imagine when I was exchanging marriage vows with my beloved that I would one day be among the almost 50% of married people who find themselves getting divorced. But 16 years into my marriage, after 3 years of couples counseling, trying unsuccessfully to address the core issues, I was finally ready to consider the idea of a divorce. I was terrified and ashamed. So much that was precious to me was on the line. To begin with, I was married to a woman. Contemplating divorce felt like a betrayal of the effort of countless people to give us the right to marry. Second, as a UU minister, contemplating breaking my marriage covenant seemed like it might undermine my ability to do my job, if not unravel my faith. You know, we UUs are big on covenants and staying at the table. Third, at the time I was serving a church as the associate minister for faith development, and the congregation was quite attached to my family as a whole. We'd even played Mary, Joseph, Baby Jesus, and a Twinkling Star in the Christmas pageant just a few days after my second child was born, something people still talked about years later. Fears haunted me. How would people at church deal with the news that we were divorcing? Would I be able to withstand all their feelings and opinions? Fourth, my family was living in a small co-housing community of 3 UU families, all sharing one property, and we functioned in some ways as an extended family, sharing birthdays and many holidays together. In fact, as good UUs, we had a covenant, and that covenant declared we were intending to live that way for the rest of our lives. Something none of us had actually put in our marriage covenants. Divorce was not really a possibility we had contemplated, and it would certainly disrupt the whole system. I feared the hurt and anger that might cause. And the uncertainty of what a divorce would mean for all of us was almost paralyzing. And finally, there were our children. Like most parents, the last thing I wanted to do was anything that would harm them, and I knew on some level that divorce would shatter their world. I had no idea where to begin. So, as is the tradition in my family, when wanting to learn how to do something we don't know how to do, I went to the library. My parents had built several additions onto our family home, mostly learning how to do it from books they'd checked out at the library. So if the library could help them build a house, perhaps it could help me figure out how to end my marriage without ruining my life or anyone else's. One book stuck out above the rest, and that was Catherine Woodward Thomas's Conscious Uncoupling: 5 Steps to Living Happily Even After. In this practical and heartfelt book, the author sets out a moral framework for divorce that allows everyone to come through the process healthy and whole. That book was my guiding light as I dug deep and got brave and charted a course through the tidal wave of resistance, mine and everyone else's, towards divorce. Before I go on, I'm actually curious about something, and I'd love for you to help me out if you're willing. You get to decide what you're willing to share, but I'm going to ask you a few questions, and if your response is in the affirmative, if you just signal that by raising your hand. How many of you have someone in your immediate family, and this is birth or chosen, who has married? How many of you have someone in your immediate family who has divorced? How many of you have experienced breakups of relationships that were painful or disorienting? Yeah. How many of you recall listening to a sermon that dealt with commitment, covenant, or marriage? Okay. How many of you recall listening to a sermon that addressed divorce or dissolution of a covenant? Okay. How many of you have attended a wedding or commitment ceremony connected to this congregation? All right. How many of you have attended a divorce or uncoupling ritual connected to this congregation? Okay, there were a few surprises there for me, but it was not, that was about what I expected. And I appreciate your willingness to come forward with your responses. As a religious community, I believe UUs have some room for improvement in how we offer support, education, and rituals regarding the reality of divorce in our lives and in the lives of our loved ones. Just as the teenagers in our congregations are incredible ambassadors about healthy relationships and sexuality in their relationships and peer groups as they go through high school and young adulthood, I believe UU congregations could empower us to be ambassadors in our families, workplaces, and communities about a way to break up. So all kinds of, endings of relationships that is healing, kind, loving, and respectful for all involved. I believe our congregations could be a place that supports such a possibility in community, allowing both parties to stay part of their church community and the children of divorced people to experience an expanded, extended family and that continues to hold them in love. It's a tangible way of putting our UU values into action in the world. So let me share with you a brief overview of Divorce 101. I didn't know any of this when I first headed to the library. Lurking in the shadows of my mind were stories of acrimonious divorces and beliefs that divorce would permanently hurt my children. What I learned was that divorce can indeed cause strong emotions and vengeful impulses, and that if handled poorly, divorce can cause harm to everyone involved, including children. But it doesn't have to be that way. Our understanding of marriage in this country has evolved dramatically over the past 150 to 200 years. In addition to partnership in the practical matters of life, we seek emotional connection and intimacy, personal growth, and support in our marriages in ways that were not commonplace in prior centuries. But the hardwire biology of marriage or any long-term partnership is still the same as the pair bonding when our lifespan as the human species was much shorter and our existence much closer to bare survival. So our biology has not caught up with the current realities of longer lifespans and more complex understandings and expectations for marriage. And once bonded, nature does not want us to unbond. When it does, our nervous systems go into high alert, along with the fight, flight, or freeze responses of a mammal under threat. It can feel as though we're going to die. Our soul can feel unmoored or homeless. It's not uncommon for people to experience intense waves of unfamiliar emotions like hatred and rage, or a desire for retaliation and revenge. Active hate is another way of staying bonded, which can account for the seemingly mysterious flip from soulmate to soul hate. So with these survival fears kicked up, destructive dynamics can play out in negotiations over things like dividing property or other belongings, or negotiating parenting arrangements. On top of that, divorce registers right up there with the death of a loved one in terms of the loss we experience. The loss of routines, home, familiar habits, smells. Sometimes there's a loss of extended family or community or familiar activities in social circles. And if children are involved, there's inevitably a loss of the amount of time each parent gets to spend with each child. There's also the loss of the dream of what was supposed to be, and on some level, a loss of identity. And as you know, grief has its own often overwhelming impacts on body, mind, and spirit. So no doubt, divorce can be a treacherous path to travel. Fortunately, we don't have to let reactivity and the inevitable emotional storm of a breakup guide our actions. With intentionality, guided by values such as the respect for the inherent worth and dignity of every person that most UUs hold dear, anyone whose heart has been wounded at the core by a breakup can consciously complete that process, move through the disorientation, pain, and grief, heal their heart, act from their values, and learn to love and trust again. Families can expand to include new members and new constellations. Dr. Ahrens, in her pioneering book, The Good Divorce, Keeping Your Family Together When Your Marriage Comes Apart, speaks of binuclear families that are created after a divorce. Study after study confirms what many of us know from experience. It's not divorce itself that harms children. It's conflict, tension, or being used as a pawn in between two fiery foes that harms children. Aaron writes, in good divorces, couples part without destroying the lives of those they love. Their children continue to have two parents. The divorced parents continue to have good relationships with their children. The families of these good divorces continue to be just that, families. So, how do people, amidst one of the most painful experiences of being human, manage to wrangle their emotions and base impulses and engage instead in conscious uncoupling? In her book, Catherine Woodward Thomas elaborates on 5 steps of the process, and I'll just explain them briefly. Step 1 is to find emotional freedom. This step teaches people to name, contain, and hold their strong emotions from a deeper, wider center within themselves. There's no discouragement for having strong emotions. Arise, they will. I remember days of uncontrollable tears, moments when a flare of anger would just take over my whole body. Times I had to excuse myself from a family gathering just to find a private place to let sobs rack my body. I learned to care for myself in these moments by naming, validating, and holding the feelings from just a deeper, wider center within me. Sometimes I asked for help from the source of life, or from a friend, or a therapist, or a spiritual director. And I learned to harness these feelings for their transformative power. For example, my anger helped me wake up to the fact that I wanted to be treated better and that I had some learning to do about boundaries. Once emotions are held and honored, they can relinquish control of the driver's seat. Then people can develop the capacity to consciously choose their actions that align with their values and act with integrity. Step 2 is to reclaim your power and your life. The breakdown of a breakup is fertile ground for being able to see the patterns that have not served well. All our stuff is right on the surface. This step inspires us to take empowered self-responsibility by learning to ask generative questions, staying out of shame and blame. We can begin to see things like how we were giving our power away, or what motivated us to show up in ways that enabled unhealthy patterns, or where we minimized red flags, or failed to presence our own feelings and needs. Even when a breakup is 97% the other person's bad behavior, you can still get curious about your own 3%. And from there, we can make amends, sometimes to another, sometimes to ourselves, by committing to do it differently moving forward. And that often requires developing new capacities and skills. For me, this was one of the most powerful steps of the process. Once I saw clearly how I habitually put the needs of my family system over my own needs and desires, and how I essentially abandoned myself and stopped communicating my true feelings and needs in my relationship, I committed not to do that again. I realized I would need to grow my capacity to tolerate disequilibrium in relationships, to stay true to myself, and also nurture my ability to recognize my own feelings or needs and desires so that I could communicate them to others in a way that they could hear, as well as learn to set boundaries that prioritized my own feelings and needs. It's an ongoing practice for me, but I can already see how it is paying off in greater health in my family system and my relationships. The third step is to break the pattern and heal your heart. This step is a deep dive into the beliefs and stories we form about ourselves in relation to things that happened when we were very young. The ways we related to others as a young person for our survival are designed to keep us in that old story. And again, all this is right on top in a breakup. These false stories are right there in our bodies. Often things like I'm invisible, or I don't matter, or I'm not lovable, or I'm not enough. Left to run their natural course, we go about our lives accumulating evidence to reinforce these stories. So the third step is to help us identify, deconstruct, and challenge these false stories and begin to mentor ourselves with a deeper truth, aligned with a deeper truth, such as I'm a gift of the universe, loved by all of life, or I'm worthy beyond measure, or I'm a powerful, visible presence in the world here to have an impact. From there, we can develop new skills and practices relating that might feel uncomfortable at first, but ultimately will generate evidence for this deeper truth. Step 4 is named playfully, become a love alchemist. From the stronger center of identity established in the last step, we can now articulate an intention for the future of our relationship with our former partner. Practices of generosity, forgiveness, opportunity to create closure and cohesion, and new communication guidelines with our former partner all come into play in this step. Having graduated from our old patterns, we can chart a course into new future possibilities. And step 5, create your happily even after life. In this step, we name new agreements about our relationship appropriate to the new form. Often the new relationship is friendly but formal. While some couples can emerge from this process as close friends, that is a high bar and not for everyone. Some people engage in a conscious uncoupling ritual in this step, and people explore processes for structures for housing, parenting, and finances, seeking a win-win solution. It's very common for people to experience a financial dip for 2 to 3 years after a divorce. So this step looks at the well-being of everyone involved, not just emphasizing any one person's financial gain. And at this stage, a mediator or lawyer is often engaged to help with the legal process and the details. All parties make commitments to speak well of the other person in public and not divide their shared communities or pull on people to take sides. If co-parenting schedules haven't been formalized, they're set up in this step. My former spouse and I sought support from a UU minister, a colleague of mine, to facilitate a conscious uncoupling ritual for us. We spoke about our intentions as co-parents and how we wanted to treat each other in the months and years ahead. For the ritual, we invited our co-housing community as witnesses. I anticipated that day with a great deal of dread. It took all my years of practice staying with my breath to stay in that room. We took off our wedding rings and spoke of the many gifts and blessings of our time as married partners. We released our marriage covenant and entered into a co-parenting covenant. It was both beautiful and painful. One of our children ran from the room. Partway through the ritual, the pain of his parents' divorce was too much to hold in that moment. But the ritual named a new truth that was important for all of us to integrate, both our family and our community. Only 4 months after that ritual, life threw something unexpected our way. My former partner was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And since we were still in the midst of COVID lockdowns, I agreed to honor her request to move back in full-time and care for our children while she died. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. Every cell in my body wanted separation from this person I was divorcing, and yet I was back into a daily proximity that felt excruciating. I was facing the death of my children's other mother and all the grief that entailed. We were again co-parenting, and children losing their other mother are not the easiest to co-parent. With all the challenges that held for us, only this time the canvas was literally life and death. Our community mobilized to care for my former partner and our children. On the one hand, I was deeply, deeply grateful. And on the other, it was incredibly lonely for me. It took everything I had and then some to uphold our co-parenting covenant and our respectful communication guidelines. Especially in that crucible, the conscious uncoupling process was a blessing. To my great surprise, a few months before she died, my former partner thanked me for initiating our divorce. She said she wouldn't have had the courage, and it was absolutely the right thing. In her journey of living with and dying from cancer, she had learned to let herself be loved, and in fact felt lovable, perhaps for the first time in her life. That might not have happened if we had stayed married. Several days before she passed, she gave me her complete trust as the parent of our 2 teenagers and blessed my future happiness with another partner. I will be forever grateful that the conscious uncoupling process created a container to hold our separation well, even under such extreme circumstances. And then life threw something else unexpected our way. Divorce, cancer, COVID, and death turned out to be a little bit too much for our co-housing community to hold. Despite all of us doing the best we could, relationships strained and ruptured. I eventually moved out of the community with my teens down the block. We now live in a house where we reconstellated as a family of 3. And I went through all the conscious uncoupling steps all over again as I learned to be a coach, this time with a community as my focus. I learned from my losses and disappointments and let the pain break open my heart again and move me into yet more growth. I reinforced commitments about how I will show up in my relationships moving forward. And I'm happy to say that woven into our ongoing journey of grief, warmth and laughter are returning to our home. My teens are doing well, and I have new healthy love in my life that amazes me most every day. I'm still sorting out how I interact with the former members of our co-housing community. For now, we're cordial neighbors, friendly when we see one another, but more formal and distant than we were when our lives were entwined every day. My children still come and go from the community held in their loving embrace. The patterns of our family life have stretched to accommodate our changing relationships. And there are still days when my heart aches from all the pain and loss, and when grief still knocks me to my knees. I love being a conscious uncoupling coach, supporting people through this process that has meant so much to me and my family, and I'm repeatedly in awe of how it transforms lives. My journey is an unusual one, but the point I want to make clear this morning is that breakups, separations, and divorces happen between individuals and communities. For many people, enduring the excruciating pain of an ending is better than spending years in the ongoing pain of a bad marriage or a partnership, or being intertwined in a community that is no longer a fit. As a religious community, we can offer education and support on how to part in respectful, healthy, and growthful ways with everyone's well-being in mind, especially our children's. Can you imagine this community gathering to honor the ending of a relationship or marriage, and when there's children involved, blessing the new parenting arrangement? Well, let me just say that again. I got a little lost in my notes. Can you imagine this community gathering to honor the ending of a relationship or marriage? I can see it. And when there are children, blessing a new co-parenting covenant. Can you imagine embracing both parties in those awful, disorienting early weeks and months, validating and helping to contain the sometimes overwhelming emotions without needing the stories to align and without taking sides? Can you imagine gently encouraging people to leave behind blame and shame and victimized thinking and take self-responsibility for the way they want to live? Let us allow our UU values to infuse not only celebrations of commitment and the creation of covenants, but the ending and letting go of covenants as well. This is how we grow consciousness on planet Earth, how we grow our capacity to honor and love one another. We do this for our grandchildren's grandchildren in celebration and care for all beings. Amen, and blessed be.